Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis of how it impacts your work. Plus, we are diving into a situation in Northern California where our superintendents are having to engage in federal advocacy to keep their school districts running. It was a story that we read in the LA Times last week. We'll talk to two of those superintendents coming up.
The ACSA legislative lunch break starts now.
And it's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA legislative lunch break, along with Executive Director Dr. Edgar Zazweta. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing Communications. Welcome. We're honored to have you with us today. Go ahead and jump onto the chat. Say hello and let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
Good week. I know some people referencing the sun as I'm looking outside here in Sacramento. We have some sun. I know it's been a rough weather winter, right? And I think this is actually I'm interested to talk to our guest today because I think of all the challenges that we think about, some of our small rural schools, the weather, like accessibility. This is all part of the of the challenges that a lot of our leaders and our educators and our communities face. So I'm actually glad that we're finally getting an opportunity, as you and I have talked about. This is the majority of our state, right? Like the majority of our state are what you would consider small schools, and most of them in a rural setting. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, this is going to be a unique conversation with two of the superintendents up in Northern California that have to go to the federal government to advocate for money to keep educating their students. We'll talk to them in just a couple of moments. Lester Powell was first on our chat today, Sheldon Smith. Now, I do want to point something out to you, Edgar. Heather Armelino is on the chat, one of our very loyal viewers, one of our great ACSA members. But I want to point this out to you. In less than 30 minutes, Heather will be testifying at the state capitol, along with Tony Thurmond, Linda Darling-Hammond, an informational hearing called Schools Emerging from the Pandemic. So that starts at 1:30. Heather being here on the show brings me back to when Maria Thompson was watching our broadcast at the end of an ACSA board meeting. Like, that's a commitment to still be here on the show while you've got something else going on.
Yeah, I saw Heather's name today on as our team was talking about this informational hearing, and I think it's great, kind of in the theme of today's conversation, of really getting that perspective from a different sector of our schools. So Heather would be a great representative. Apparently she's not too nervous. If she's watching us here minutes before testifying to policymakers, she just goes to show how cool she is given the circumstances there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to jump from one to the other, you have to appreciate that. A couple of news headlines for you, and then we'll move on to our subject matter today. I just mentioned Tony Thurmond, two stories with Tony today. First one, he has set up a tip line to report schools that disproportionately discipline students of color or with disabilities or disguise expulsion by transferring students to other schools. He says the tip line was set up after there were reports that some districts have either involuntarily transferred students or encouraged parents to voluntarily transfer their students to other schools. According to CDE, the department also plans to offer guidance to school districts about how to more fairly mete out, according to this article, discipline that will offer a second round of community school grants and implicit bias grants to help reduce disproportionate discipline. Edgar, we're an organization that puts students first. We talk so much about equity. So seeing that the SPI is going to devote some resources to be able to, better communicate, better get information on particular things that are taking place with respect to equity in our schools. I mean, it is a positive move to be able to start connecting some of those dots.
Yeah, I got a few messages from our members about this topic over the last day or so. And I think rightly so. I think to be expected, people understand the intent, obviously disproportionate disciplinary issues, whether it be expulsions, suspensions. That's something that ACSA as an organization, we've been trying to be at the forefront there, even pushing and supporting some of the changes that have happened on that front legislatively over the years. I think, one of the conversations we'll have with our friends at the Department of Education, how this actually works. How do we make sure that we're also making sure that anything that they get through this hotline is vetted in an appropriate way, that we're making sure we're being fair to the educators and the folks often on the receiving end. So I think we'll have more to learn on this front, but I found that as an interesting headline as well, Naj.
Yeah, and we talked so much about the start of the legislative session over the last couple of weeks. Diana Vu and Megan Baer from our governmental relations department, they were on the show 2 weeks ago, and then last week, Yvonne Carrillo, the senior director of GR and policy, and then Barrett Snyder from Capital Advisors were with us to talk about the new legislative session and some of the bills. This one caught my attention. This is from Diana Lambert over at EdSource. She's reporting that there's a proposed constitutional amendment that would make the SPI an appointed position and no longer an elected position. This is coming from Assembly Member Kevin McCarty here in Sacramento. He's introduced ACSA, which would give the governor the power to appoint the state superintendent of public instruction. The article notes that the appointee would require confirmation by the Assembly, Senate, and the Senate Rules Committee. If the amendment passes both the Senate and the Assembly, then it would be going to a vote in the 2024, if I believe correctly. It would be a statewide ballot measure, and there would be no SPI election then in 2026 if it passes. The article also notes that there have been previous attempts to make the SPI an appointed position. Edgar, you had some clarity on the timeline of this, because the SPI, if I'm correct, is a 2-term, 4 years per term time frame. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, and I think Assemblyman McCarty has specified this. The intent is obviously not to impact our current superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurman. It's that this would go into place post his tenure. With that being said, and I'll start by saying ACSA doesn't have a position on this policy issue yet. We haven't even dug into it. I think it's an interesting conversation from the perspective of that a lot of other states, and this has come up here in California, that in other states you do have the governor's office, and the state school official is really extension of the governor's office, right? In this state, we kind of have this 3-tier system where you have the governor and his staff, which obviously has been impact on policy and decisions. You have the State Board of Education, which is another governing body. Those folks are also appointed by the governor. And then you have an independently elected constitutional officer in the state superintendent, right? So I think it's fair to say that we have a unique kind of situation here in California. Now, to what extent, what would be the practical changes given a change like this? I think it'll be interesting. And I'm curious to see how much traction this conversation has. In the past, it's been thrown out there and it hasn't gone anywhere. So I think Kevin McCarty is, somebody who's, I would say, at the forefront of leadership from the policy end in terms of the Capitol. So he's going to have some sway here. Now, whether he gets traction on this conversation is something we'll be watching for.
Yeah, something to continue to monitor as this legislative session begins. Let's go ahead and switch to our topic. Edgar and I talked about this last week, this LA Times article about 4 of our superintendents up in Northern California that are having to go to the federal government to get the funding to keep their schools open and educating schools. A couple of them right over there. You're going to see them right now. Jamie Green is the superintendent in Trinity Alps Unified School District in Weaverville. Anne-Marie Swanstrom is superintendent, Mountain Valley Unified School District in Hayfork. Jamie and Anne-Marie, it is so great to have you on the show. It was great to see this LA Times article, and it really got us thinking about the uniqueness of the story for both of you. Let me just go to a couple of pieces of information. I'll get your feedback. According to the article, 75% of the land in your respective districts is owned by the federal government. This ownership model trickles down to the tax base and the ability to secure state funding. which is why you have to go to the federal government to talk about funding. So let's go deeper into your respective districts and the measures that you're having to take to fund your schools. Anne-Marie, I'll have you go first.
Well, you know, what COVID did bring was a lot of money. And I think we've been able to actually operate our school at the level that it should always be operated at. But that's with, you know, an extra $1.2 million over the last, you know, couple of years. And of course, this is all one-time monies and they're going away. And I think the idea that the Forest Reserve also isn't secure is another reason why, you know, Jamie and I feel so strongly about really, you know, giving a voice to the small schools, the rural districts, because our plight, and I'm going to use that word because that's exactly what it is just so much more so than people can even realize. I think that going as kind of a, you know, a coalition and speaking with, you know, our lawmakers really gave them a kind of a face to the smaller school districts that we don't usually have a voice. It's funny because listening to you, you brought up the word equity, and California uses the word equity, you know, just all over the place. But I'm going to argue that our kids in rural areas are not receiving the equity that they deserve. And that's why, you know, Jamie and I have always been advocates for kids in these rural areas. We've both worked in these districts for many, many years in a variety of capacities. And now we are superintendents. And I think that it's just so critical that we advocate for the support and funding that our kids deserve.
Jamie, what would you add?
Well, I would say in 1908, Congress passed the Secure Rural Schools Act, where they said there would be equity between urban and rural schools 115 years ago. If the federal government didn't they didn't want to call it a tax, so they called it the Forest Reserve, but they would give X amount of monies to balance out what property tax we would be able to collect. So in schools like Elk Grove, where they're building, they have all that new construction and that money goes into the schools, and the schools are absolutely beautiful. And all kids should have those types of schools. We were there yesterday. So what they've done is they authorize this every 3 or 5 or 6 years. And the Secure Rural Schools Act comes up in 24, 25. And in our district, it would go from $500,000 down to 30,000. That means I'm laying off 6 to 8 employees.
Yeah.
And in 2004, and we have a slide on that, my district used to get $2 million from the federal government to run our school. So if you look at it, the reason why we did a grassroots movement, Joe Biden said we need to pay teachers more. I agree with him. He said that in the State of the Union address. I think the state of California has done a phenomenal job in funding my school, Anne-Marie's, everybody else. So we just wanted to reach across the table to the federal government and work on equity for everybody. There's 4,400 school districts across the country that get Secure Rural Schools money. So we figured 4 or 5 of us would go and just represent 4,400 schools. That was our goal. And it's picking up momentum, and it looks like it might get reauthorized.
Anne-Marie, I'll ask you a question kind of off along the lines of what you talked about. And if Jamie wants to jump in, he could add his piece. You know, for a lot of our folks and a lot of folks in your community, they know, right? They're not taking for granted the unique nature of educating kids in your respective communities. For much of the state, I know something that we've heard from our small school members and educators in general, that these issues don't get as much attention. I think here in the Capitol, even though the majority are schools that maybe look more like yours, or district. I mean, I know there's a difference between the number of students and the number of districts or even communities that we have look like that. Kind of take us behind the scene. For those that are joining us today that maybe have never been to a community like yours, why is this so important? Why is it the unique nature of your respective communities? And how is the lack of this funding, how could it impact the kids in the classroom?
Well, I'm just going to say, if you've never seen rural poverty, you've never seen true poverty. And the district that I work in, we're 84% socioeconomically disadvantaged. Our access to resources, and I'm just going to say it, is even less than where Jamie is in Weaverville. We come up against challenges that you only see with generational poverty. The level of suicides, homicides, substance abuse, death from firearms is just, it's astounding. And we deal with those and we support our kids here in the schools. So our schools provide something very different than what schools in urban areas provide, because they have all the resources at their fingertips. They can send the kids to the YMCA after school. They can utilize, the healthcare that is, very accessible. We do not have that here. As a school, we kind of are the heart of the community, absolutely. And we provide resources and support, mental health support, medical support that they just wouldn't have otherwise. These kids are very isolated. They don't get out much. If they do get out, it's from it's a school trip that we've provided. We're the constant supportive adults in their lives. It is it's a calling, I'm going to say, to work in these areas. I've always kind of described it as like the longest, Peace Corps mission possible. And I think people need to realize what we're up against. Not only are there fires burning everywhere, we just, Jamie and I are on our third day of no school because of the snow. It truly is one thing or another. And I don't want to sound like, oh, poor us. But I do want people to understand what we are up against is it's beyond the pale. And, like I said, we are kind of teased, getting all that COVID money and being able to maintain our programs and pay our people like we should. And now that's going away. And, really our only choice at this point is to make sure that we get, the forest reserves and that they are, protected and consistent. Otherwise, we will start to see, and I speak for many other schools like mine that have had declining enrollment, that have just been hammered by, the inability to hire people, just because of our location. The challenges are nonstop, and they're that way everywhere in education. Ours are just very different, and the stakes are so high.
Right.
Jamie, Anne-Marie did a nice job of just kind of painting that picture for us of what it is these communities sometimes look like, and sometimes folks don't have a complete perspective. Anything you would add to that?
Well, like mental health, both her and I were both school counselors before we became superintendents, so we focus on that. It's an hour away from a healthcare professional. We also send buses. Both of us send buses an hour and a half one direction. So it's a 3-hour round trip on a bus. And we send out 4 buses north, south, east, west, because my district's 1,700 square miles. And if you took 1,700 square miles in Los Angeles, you might have, 100 or 200,000 students, and we don't. So it's a different ballgame. We have to pay for that transportation to get there and back. And where we put our money first is we're going to transport the kids first. We're going to feed them second. We're going to educate and love them third. And then we don't have the facility repair money that other schools do, and we get in trouble with it. So like I said earlier, the Secure Rural Schools Act, the federal government, both of the congressmen we met with and the senators, they understood our plight and they agreed with us, and they said they're going to do their best to get it funded. It'll be catastrophic to 4,400 schools if this doesn't get funded. And we're going back in April, and then we'll be at the ACSA advocacy also. This has to get through by next October, or there's going to be thousands of employees laid off across the country. It's not a small issue.
No.
Folks, want to remind you, if you have questions for Anne-Marie or for Jamie, go ahead and put those into the chat, and we'll try and tackle those before the end of the show. Jamie, Anne-Marie had made mention of the fires.
Yep.
I know that you and I, before the show, talked a little bit about the storms that have come through. How has it been managing the natural disasters that districts, school communities like yours are impacted with every single year. What's that experience like?
It's very difficult because the forests they burn hotter, they burn faster. They're not the old time fires. So when we went to Washington, we asked for possibility of select cutting, which would take half of the fuel out, but not clear cut. And then we also offered that they could put windmills and they could put solar farms up and create energy, because we didn't want to go and ask for a handout. We wanted to say, can you use the federal lands to make an income, to supply jobs, to help rural communities? And we got real positive from both the Democrats and Republicans about the windmills and select cutting. And like I said, we're going to go back and talk about that because we want it to be paid for. We don't want a handout. We just want to, we cannot collect property tax, neither Anne Marie or I or MoDOC or Siskiyou County. We can't collect property tax. So the only way to get money is to create an income.
I'll send the next question to both of you. I'll start with Anne Marie. In the LA Times article, it talked about, well, obviously described your advocacy effort back there, and I thought it was actually great that the LA Times, I think it arguably the biggest newspaper in our state, was putting this attention on our schools that look like yours, which doesn't always happen. So kudos to them on that front.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to get a sense of just what the pressure is. What does it look like in terms of the political landscape, in terms of what you've heard of how likely it is? Are you going to get some of this pushback? We know that there's a related front that there had been some reauthorization of the Rural Schools and Self-Determination Act a few times, and that seems like it's gone relatively smoothly, and that there's been bipartisan support on some of these fronts. But what's your sense? Are we in for a fight here, or do we have the support necessary? I'll start with Anne Marie, and then I'll let Jamie chime in.
Well, I feel like it's like we go to them and they say, "Oh yeah," but it's just always, I guess what Jamie and I have been trying to do, and Jamie more so, is push it to the front burner. I think it's always there and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, we know about that." But in the end, it's like, what are you really doing about it? And I think that's why we've come forward, to really advocate for it and say, hey, this is something that we at least need some, 3 years is not enough. And then just never knowing, I think it's the never knowing. How are we supposed to, budget? How are we supposed to plan? When I think the unknown outweighs what we, can count on, I think that's when it just becomes really urgent.
Jamie?
Yeah, I would say we definitely need help. When we told Congressman LaMalfa and Huffman that we had lost 75% of the value of this since 2004, neither one of them knew that.
No.
So you have to go and you have to meet with them in person, and you have to bring your business manager and show them your spreadsheets. In 2016, they didn't refund this. So in 2016, my district laid off several employees. So did people across the country. So then they reauthorized it in 17, 18, 19, 20. And then they did a new one that goes through next year. But in 24, 25, if they don't reauthorize it, it's going to be catastrophic for children. We're focused on kids here. It's going to be catastrophic. Mm-hmm. And you look at like what Mr. Biden said about pay teachers more. Congressman Jeffries gave one of the most beautiful speeches ever to introduce the 118th conference or the Congress. And he focused on rural America. He said the federal government needs to help with rural America. So if you're asking us if we want help, absolutely. Rural America definitely needs help right now. If we could get ACSA and Small School Districts Association, which both of you guys have been helping a lot, we need to bring this to the front of the burner. Otherwise, people are going to talk and it's not going to get reauthorized. We're very, very concerned.
Let me ask both of you, because we're going to have Megan Dolly, who is the Assemblywoman representing District 1 and the Vice Chair of the Assembly Education Committee, on next week's show to discuss the new legislative session, priorities, all of that. But in that LA Times article, she has two quotes. I'm going to read them real quickly. Having school administrators plead for forced reserve dollars every few years is not sustainable, and they don't have the resources of bigger districts for expenses like grant writing. We need to solve the funding issue once and for all and get back to the business of educating our kids. Okay, now both of you have talked about the federal lawmakers listening. Is there a grasp of the issue once you've had the opportunity to advocate? Is there a lot of education that the two of you are having to do to get the point across, especially when, Jamie, you just talked about, Congressman Jeffries talked about the rural communities and all of that as he introduced the Congress. Well, this is a fairly important issue when it impacts 4,400 school districts. Emery, I'll have you start. Do you think that the federal government is getting it?
I think that they understand it to a certain extent, but I don't think people who haven't lived and seen rural living really understand just kind of the brevity of what this kind of funding will do for kids or will not do for kids. I think that it's easy to sit in a city where amenities are so, easily attained and, life is pretty comfortable and easy. And you don't, out of sight, out of mind. I don't think you realize just how hard it is for people who live in rural communities to, face the challenges. And I feel like if you take away the legs of a school district, we will see the complete decimation of, rural living. And I think that is a bigger conversation, really, because again, what Jamie and I do is more than just educate kids, far more than that.
Right. Jamie, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think they were because we were there with them. I think they were definitely listening and they definitely cared. And my biggest pitch today is that we talk to the federal government to help out the state of California. It's not just the rural schools with the Forest Service around them. It's all rural schools. And I think there's an opportunity to work with the federal government to make sure we have equity in all schools across the country. All children should be treated equal no matter what school they're in. And the federal government has a big enough budget to be able to make sure that happens. Mm-hmm. So we really want to focus on that. Work with the federal government. President Biden said pay teachers more. Okay. If the federal government gives each state more money, we could pay teachers more. We pay teachers more. We have a more quality education and we have more teachers going into the field. So I think it's an opportunity. I think it's a lot bigger than what people are seeing right now because we're talking equity. Well, let's see where the inequities are and let's rectify those across the board.
Jamie, I'll ask you the next question. And I think it was Gary who threw it out. And it did make it, we've been talking about the federal government's role here and what we're asking them to do. I know we've had these conversations. We've heard it from folks like you. We've heard it from the Small Schools Districts Association. A lot of our members is what's the interaction with the state, just in general, not even relating to this issue, but how would you say that the state, given all of the funding formulas, given everything we have in place, the majority of the funding we get comes from the state. Yeah. Do you think that the rules or the funding systems are set up to truly support our small rural schools from a state perspective?
So in our situation, if we weren't surrounded by federal land, we would have more property tax and the LCFF would work. And as for the state to help my school, Senator McGuire, Superintendent Thurmond directly helped us secure $31 million to rebuild our schools after they were deemed unhealthy for students. So the state of California, in my opinion, is bent over backwards for Trinity Alps. I am beyond blessed that the people at OPSC, like Barbara, they have taken it personal. They have helped us. They've been amazing. I wrote them letters stating that. So I feel at this point, it's time for the federal government. We all pay federal taxes. They're our friends. I'm surrounded by federal land that they pay their part. And that's where I feel. I don't think it's any more a state of California issue with my district. It could be with other ones. But honestly, if you read the Act of 1908, we should be getting $2 million a year, not $500,000. And then I could educate my kids properly.
Jamie, I know that you had made mention of this particular quote, and Anne asks, would you be so kind as to repeat what you had just said regarding how many people will lose their jobs? What is the trickle-down effect? I believe you were talking about
I'll tell you what, it'll be thousands. There's a New York Times article. I forgot the date, but it's in my stuff. And there was a superintendent that said it would be catastrophic the last time they almost didn't authorize this. We know we'll lose 6 to 8 people. We've done our projections. So let's say 4,400 school districts across the country. That'll be thousands of employees will lose their jobs. That means we're not serving special needs kids. We're having a difficult time feeding kids. We don't have a library. It puts us below the part where we're going to be functional for our students. And like I said earlier, why doesn't every kid in this country have the same opportunity? That's the beauty of public schools. Every child should have the exact same opportunities. And without money, you simply can't do that. We can only fundraise so much.
Jamie Green, Superintendent, Trinity Alps Unified School District in Weaverville. Anne-Marie Swanstrom, Superintendent, Mountain Valley Unified School District in Hayfork. Jamie and Anne-Marie, it's been an honor to have you here on the show with us. Thank you for being great student advocates and going to the federal government to advocate on behalf of your school communities. Have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Great discussion. Edgar, we did have a question. I just wanted to quickly bring that up to you. I'm going to work my way through the chat.
While you're looking for that, I just want to take a moment. It really stuck with me with Anne-Marie and both Jamie said in terms of that this is not just a job, it's a calling. And, hearing them, it goes to what we're talking about. And I know I've committed myself. This spring. I actually want to see more of our schools and more of our communities that look like this. I think it'll help us better do our job of advocating for them as well. And I think in that same note, it's a reminder that we should be inviting those policymakers to go see it themselves, right? That you're not going to have, as Anne-Marie said, you're not going to have this true appreciation unless you see it yourself. I think is a great reminder for all of us.
Yeah. Our good friend Neri Pais asked the question. Well, not even a question, it was more of a comment, but I'll have you maybe comment on it. Just a reminder that we need to fight for the restoration of arts allocation. What can you tell us about what's going on with that arts allocation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of our top priorities. I was just reviewing some correspondence we're putting out to the legislature here, I think today, in the next couple days. It's one of our top priorities. This is us making sure that we push the state to go in a different direction than redirecting that arts and instructional materials discretionary funds. And we keep reminding folks, the state said, that they gave us a lot of ideas what we could use it for. Districts, schools made decisions on these dollars. So for them to go back and take them away, you're going to impact kids. You're going to impact services. So we think there's some momentum there. We won't really know on this until they get deeper into the budget negotiations. But Teneri and everybody else who's concerned about this, just know that it is one of the top ACSA positions, and our team is going to be pushing hard on this. It's going to probably be a major focus of our Ledge Action Day as well in April. So for those that are going to join us, that they'll have a part in advocating on that issue.
You know what? We're probably really lucky that Neri hopefully has lost our phone numbers, or else I suspect that we'd be getting a once a week text to remind us.
I love that he's on message. He's not going to let us forget. So
no, he certainly isn't. Folks, if you like what you've seen, we ask you to subscribe to us on YouTube and like us on Facebook. You'll get alerts when we're about to come on with our live coverage of any news breaking events, and of course, promotions for our ACSA legislative lunch break on Wednesdays. Go ahead and subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook. And if you have some great stories to tell about what's happening in your school communities, go ahead and send those for EdCal. Our EdCal editor, Michelle Carl, always looking for great stories to tell. You can send those in to mcarl@acsa.org. That gives me the opportunity, Edgar, to shout out to our great colleagues over at Oceanside Unified School District and San Marcos Unified School District. I was honored to be in both of their districts last Friday to cover a couple of stories, so we will feature those coming up in EdCal. Folks, have a great rest of the day, rest of the week. Don't forget, next Wednesday, we are live and interactive with Assemblywoman Megan Dolly. She'll join us to talk about the new legislative session and legislative priorities that comes your way. Live and interactive, 1 p.m. next Wednesday here at ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Again, have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.